Hi, this is a bit of a different Azzattack this week. I thought I would talk about Stan Lee and the shit I liked that he made. So, firstly, let me say there are a lot of people out there who. It's basically what happened when Steve Jobs died. You know, a lot of people come out of the woodwork and think this is the right time to point out the history of Stan Lee and talk about his actual contributions to comics and Marvel and everything. Like, no, he didn't create those characters by himself. And, you know, a lot of characters he didn't create at all. But he co-created a lot of big ones. And to point out the fact that he didn't do it all by himself just makes you look like a fucking douchebag. Like, of course he didn't do it by himself. Who the fuck thinks he did? But by pointing out the fact that he didn't solely create the characters takes away from the fact that he did co-create them. So, you know, fucking take a step back. Anyway, I wanted to talk about Spider-Man. When I was a kid, preschool, very early days of primary school, I liked superheroes. The two big ones for me were Superman and Batman. I loved the Christopher Reeve Superman movies. I liked Tim Burton's. That's weird how I did that. I named the actor of one of them and then the director of the other one. That's weird. I liked Richard Donner's Superman movie and I liked Tim Burton's Batman movie. And then Batman Returns was even better, and Superman 2 was, at the time for me, even better, but looking back on it and knowing the history behind it. Anyway, we're not here to discuss that. I liked Superman and Batman, alright? But then 1994 swings around, and I'm in year 4. The Spider-Man animated TV show comes around. It starts on the television. And I am into that shit. And, it was introduced to me by my friends at the time, and they were collecting Spider-Man cards, and they had one with Carnage on it, and I was like, that's fucking badass. Spider-Man was a revelation to me, because unlike Superman and Batman, where they just seem to have endless powers and no problems, how can you have a problem when you can spin the Earth backwards and reverse time? But Spider-Man had problems, but he was also a superhero, and how do you manage your actual life with your superhero life? And at the time, for me, that was unique. And he had the best rogues gallery out of any superhero. Green Goblin, Doc Ock, Carnage, Venom. Just so many just awesome villains. And the TV show was one thing. And as adults now, we obviously watch that show and we go, there's better Spider-Man shows out there. But for the time, it was the best Spider-Man show. And maybe every now and then we'll go rent that weird live-action movie that was god-awful. But this was my introduction to comic books. I liked superheroes, but I had seen movies. Comic books were a different thing that I hadn't been introduced to yet. And I really liked the art on those cards, so I was like, I want to read comic books. But the mid-90s in Australia, when it comes to buying comic books, it wasn't the easiest thing. You would kind of just pick up whatever was going at the newsagents when you're in there. It was hard. If you liked comic books, just fucking roll a dice and see what you get. In the early 2000s, it became a bit easier, so I would buy comics whenever I could. Batman, Superman, because I still liked them. And usually like Ultimate Spider-Man. I love the art in comics, and I loved the... Comics have very strange writing patterns. Like, the language isn't normal because they're usually describing what's happening in the panel action-wise, because you don't get the animation. So it's usually over the top and kind of dumb. And I like that. The dumber the better. Give me all the dumb. I love everything dumb. Just give me the stupidest things you have. I will cherish them. And so the first Spider-Man movie came out, the Sam Raimi one, and that's kind of where I learned about Stan Lee, from his cameo in that movie. Like, I didn't have the internet when I was in high school. I didn't like I said, I didn't have access to comics. So I found out about a lot of this stuff kind of late compared to kids these days who know everything about everything as soon as they're born. Yeah, that first Spider-Man movie made me want to find out about Stan Lee and look into history and find out about Steve Ditko and Jack Kirby and find out about other superheroes. Obviously, the first X-Men had been out by then, and Stan Lee did have a cameo in that, but it was like way in the back, and he's like at a hot dog cart or something. Not that his cameo in the first Spider-Man was any better, but by this time DVDs were a thing, and so you'd go to the special features and they'd be like, yeah, hey, Stan Lee has a cameo, or the comment. It's probably the commentary. They're probably like, there's Stan Lee, and I realized he co-created Hulk and Doctor Strange and the Fantastic Four, as well as a whole bunch of other ones. And creating comics was different back in the early days. Basically, Stan would come to whoever the artist was at the time, and they'd break a story together. The artist would go off and do their art thing, and then Stan would come back and he'd add the speech bubbles, the text. So a lot of the comic book did rely on the artist. But this is where the Steve Jobs comparison comes in with Stan. The artists create, just like the really smart people with the brains create the phones and shit. But then there has to be someone to package it and sell it. And that was Stan's main thing. He wrote, but he also edited. His voice was uniquely Stan, and you could read one of his books and you would know, yeah, that's Stan Lee right there. And because of Stan and Steve Ditko and Jack Kirby, like, they're the big three. Marvel Comics put comics in front of everyone. DC have the legacy, like, they've been around a long-ass time. But Marvel made comics cool again. To nerds, I mean, not to the cool kids. But it was still cool. Stan added complexity to superheroes that wasn't there before, and made you care about the characters rather than just reading them and going, that's cool. But Stan's legacy lives on in the MCU, and hopefully, that continues. And now that Marvel's gonna have the rights back to X-Men for the movies, maybe we'll see a good old-fashioned Stan Lee style X-Men movie. Maybe with classic Jack Kirby costumes. I don't think so, though. I mean, they came real close with X-Men First Class, so I guess that can be done. Stan lived a good, long life. 95 years old is pretty fucking good. It sucks that we won't see him in the movies after Avengers 4, probably. He was always happy, that guy. It was always, like, every interview and photo with fans and everything, he was always happy. He looked happy anyway. We can only hope to have a life as good as Stan Lee had. Thanks, Stan.